The last time we took a look at the Acura RDX was about 2 years ago, and at that time Acura had completely redesigned the RDX. They had removed the 4-cylinder turbocharged engine and put a V6 in its place, and they'd also removed the super handling all-wheel drive system, putting a regular all-wheel drive system in its place. Those two moves were almost contrary to what everybody else has been doing in this compact luxury crossover segment. Now it's 2 years later, and Acura has done something again unusual in this segment, and they've actually given this a mild refresh. The first thing you'll notice that's new about the 2016 model is this all-new front-end look, bringing it more in line with the rest of the Acura lineup. Acura has gone for an all-LED lineup in their latest vehicles, and now the RDX has that as well. It's this 5-module array. The outside 3 are the low beams, the inside 2 are the high beams. Now there has been some confusion about these LED jewel-style headlamps, but they are full LEDs. It's just that these inner 2 high beam ones use reflectors, not projectors. That's why they look a little bit different. So these are not halogen like some reviews have said. What are halogen, however, are these optional fog lamps down here, and I think that overall the front end looks a little bit more grown up than the 2014 model we saw about 2 years ago. We have slightly better integrated front parking sensors. I think the overall treatment of the front end looks a little bit more luxurious, and the Acura beak has shrunk just a tiny bit. The RDX is almost exactly the same size as the BMW X3, which makes it one of the larger entries in this compact crossover segment. It also means it's not too far off size-wise from the Lexus RX. Lexus tackles the 2-row luxury crossover segment with sort of a 1-2 punch from the Lexus NX, which is smaller than this, and the Lexus RX, which is larger than this. Now, in an interesting twist, we actually have about the same kind of front and rear seat room as we get in the Lexus RX. The main difference is right back here in the cargo area, where the RX does get extra space. Being front-wheel drive or front-wheel drive biased or based is not unusual in this segment. We have a wide variety of entries from the Lincoln MKC to even perhaps the Mercedes-Benz GLA. The main benefit to you as a shopper for buying a front-wheel drive biased or front-wheel drive based crossover is we actually get a much more efficient use of the overall exterior space. As with last year's RDX, the ride height on this vehicle is a little bit higher than your average luxury crossover at just over 8 inches. We also have 60 series tires. These particular ones are 235, 60 are 18. The reason for higher ground clearance is fairly self-explanatory, but the reason for higher profile tires is that you're less likely to damage a rim if you run over a rock or hit a curb or something along those lines. Out back, things look relatively similar to the outgoing model. We get all new LED tail lamp modules, and you'll notice that down here we have some new reflectors, a slightly different bumper design, and hidden exhaust tips. Our model does have the optional front and rear parking sensors, again very well integrated in the back, and you'll notice back here we have a styling design choice that's very similar to the Lincoln MKC in that we don't have a bumper that sticks out from the vehicle. So the tailgate and the bumper are very flush with one another. Now that does mean that in the event of a rear end accident you may incur a little bit more expense by having a damaged rear hatch, but does maximize interior space. The second generation RDX was most notable under the hood because they bucked the trend and they actually replaced a small turbocharged engine with a V6. And we essentially get a massaged version of that V6 under the 2016 hood. This engine is now good for 279 horsepower and 252 pound-feet of torque from 3.5 liters. Now to help improve fuel economy, they have given this a cylinder deactivation system, so under certain conditions it will operate as a 3-cylinder engine. Contrary to some of the rumors out there, 2016 does not bring the new ZF 9-speed automatic that we find in the MDX and the Acura TLX. Instead, we get the same 6-speed automatic that we had last year and the same optional $1,500 all-wheel drive system we had last year. That same all-wheel drive system as last year, of course, means that this does not get Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. So unlike other Acuras out there like the all-wheel drive MDX or the all-wheel drive Acura TLX, this system can only send up to 40% of the power to the rear axle instead of 90% like we get in the super handling all-wheel drive system. We also don't get any mechanical torque vectoring across the rear axle. Acura tells us that by letting go of that super handling all-wheel drive system, they've not only made this vehicle a little bit less expensive, but they've also given it better fuel economy and a lighter curb weight. Fuel economy comes in at 20 miles per gallon city, 29 highway, and 23 combined if you get the front-wheel drive version, and you knock about 1 mile per gallon off all those numbers for the all-wheel drive version. Those numbers are fairly good for this segment, although you will find higher fuel economy numbers in something like the front-wheel drive Drive-E trims of the Volvo XC60. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give this 8 out of 10 points. I didn't find these seats quite as comfortable for my body shape as the ones in the Volvo XC60, although they are just about as adjustable as you'll find in the Volvo. Now, if you want things like extending thigh cushions, inflating bolsters, etc., you're going to have to step over to the German models. Our model does have a two-way power adjustable lumbar support, a two-position seat memory, and we also have a manually tilt-telescoping steering column with a moderate range of motion. Leather is optional in the RDX, as are front-cooled seats. Our model has the optional 8-way power passenger seat up front. However, it doesn't have quite the same range of motion as the driver's seat. The seat bottom cushion doesn't go quite as close to the floor in the back, and we do not get the two-way adjustable lumbar. The RDX has a very accommodating rear seat. Unfortunately, we don't get reclining rear seat backs. These do fold in order to increase your cargo area, but they aren't adjustably reclinable. We do, however, have a very generous amount of headroom and legroom, even though our model does have the sunroof. If I move over to the middle seat, I still have definitely an adequate amount of headroom, probably about an inch left over right there, and we have a very small hump in the middle because of the way this vehicle is designed. If I scoot all the way over to the right of the vehicle, this front seat was adjusted for a 6'5" passenger. I still have about 3.5 inches of legroom left. You'll actually find more legroom in the back of this vehicle than you'll find in the current generation Lexus RX. This is definitely more accommodating than something like a Volvo XC60. We do have a padded center armrest with 2 fixed cup holders right here. And if we fold down the rear seat back, you'll notice that it is a little bit higher than the cargo area in the back. So it is a little bit more difficult to push luggage right up into the middle. One thing to note is that the center seat belt does come out of the ceiling in the RDX, not out of the seat back itself. So you do have to detach it and then clip it back up there to the ceiling if you don't want it in the way when you put cargo in the back. It also does take up a little bit of that ceiling area in the back, meaning that it's more difficult to put large, bulky items into the RDX. One of the main benefits for having a front-wheel drive entry in this segment is that we typically get more cargo room than you'll find in the rear-wheel drive entries, and that's true for the Acura RDX as well. We actually have only about 30% less space back here than we get in the Lexus RX, which is a fairly large 2-row crossover. Under the cargo load floor, you will find a temporary spare tire, which is something you don't find in every vehicle out there. You will find handles to release the rear seat backs back here and as part of the seat back itself. One area of cost cutting that I do dislike is the fact that the optional cargo cover right back here is not standard in the RDX. You do have to buy that as an accessory. When it comes to my exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to have to give this 9 out of 10 points. It is not quite as accommodating as the Lexus RX, but we do have some very nice touches. We actually have 3 helper handles on this very large trunk lid. If I can actually reach it here, you have one right over here, one on the other side, and then one on the inside, in addition to the powered trunk hatch that our particular model has. Let's take a quick spin around the interior. This is largely the same as the 2014 model we saw 2 years ago. We have height adjustable seat belts and height adjustable headrests for both the driver and the front passenger. Those are just 2-way adjustable. If we move on over to the doors, you will find a large portion of soft touch plastics in the door, as well as a decent portion of hard touch plastics lower in the door. Now, that's not terribly unusual in this segment. Most models do have a decent amount of hard plastic. The dashboard is a soft touch injection molded upper with a hard plastic lower. We do have imitation aluminum trim. You won't find real wood trim in the RDX cabin at any price like you find in some of the competition. We have a relatively large glove compartment that is tiered. There's a shelf right above there on the top. The interior color options in the RDX are tied to the exterior paint color. So not all interior color combinations are available with all exterior paint colors. Our particular model is this sort of 3-tone affair where we have that dark upper, the tan middle, and then this brown carpet down there in the footwell. The major change in this cabin is right here in the center of the dashboard, because we now get essentially the same 2-screen infotainment system that we see in a wide variety of other Acura models. The system uses this large upper screen for navigation and a wide variety of different system functions like browsing playlists, etc., and it uses this touch screen down below for easier navigation input, so it has a keyboard for certain destination entries. You also use it for changing audio sources, your shortcuts in the system, tracks forward, backward, and it displays the status of your climate control system. If you want to know more about this 2-screen infotainment system, go ahead and click that link at the bottom of your screen. You'll be taken on over to our dedicated infotainment review on this 2-screen system. Working our way down the center console, we have the control joystick for that system. It toggles up, down, side to side, rotates around, clicks to enter. We have some direct access buttons right over there, back menu button, etc. Below that, you'll find the controls for the dual zone climate control. And then below that, you will find the auxiliary input and USB input and 12-volt power outlet. Those are all part of that infotainment system, and a very large storage cubby right there. No problems putting things like cell phones, wallets, all that sort of thing in that cubby at the same time. Continuing our way back, we have a large, softly padded center armrest right there with a very large storage cubby. This is made possible because this is a front-wheel drive vehicle. Small storage level right there, and then a very large cubby. Have a digital SLR camera right in there. I was able to jam a large gallon of milk in there, although I couldn't close the lid. On the driver's side, we have an instrument cluster that is very similar to the rest of the Acura lineup, and we now have an optional color multi-information display right there in the center of everything. Large analog speedometer and tachometer there, with the fuel gauge and the engine temperature gauge smaller on either side. Moving out from that, we have essentially the same 3-spoke steering wheel we find in a wide variety of other Acura models. We have sport grips right up top and paddle shifters right behind the steering wheel. You'll find the volume controls here, track up, down, mode button, dedicated phone hang-up, pickup, and the voice command button right there. This button cycles through the various features of that multi-information display right over there. We have our lane keeping assistance button, distance control for the optional radar cruise control. That is something that the 2014 model we last tested did not have as an option. And then the rest of the regular cruise control buttons right up there. Our model has the optional AcuraLink system. This is very similar to General Motors' OnStar system. It's a telematic system. It will automatically call for help in the event of an accident. You'll find that right up here with the sunroof controls as well as the sunglass holder. I mentioned the relatively high profile tires earlier because it means that we get a better ride in the RDX when the road gets a little bit rough. And that's something that you don't normally see in this segment because most entries in the compact crossover segment are trying to be very car-like, give you excellent handling out on the road, and that generally means lower profile tires for better handling. Now this is a little bit different, however, than the Lincoln MKC, which tries to give you the same sort of thing with low profile tires and an extremely soft suspension. When it comes to acceleration, the RDX performs extremely well when you compare it to the base models of the competition. That's because we get much more power out of this 3.5-liter V6 than you get out of those small 2-liter turbos that everybody else is using, especially when you compare this to entries like the Audi Q5. We get relatively similar power to the Lexus RX 350, but we get a much lighter vehicle, and that means that we get a better 0 to 60 time even versus something like that RX 350 F Sport, which uses an 8-speed automatic transmission. Now we obviously haven't been able to test the new Lexus RX. We do expect that to be a little bit better because it should be a little bit lighter. However, it's probably not going to be as fast as this RDX still. Now obviously when we take a look at the higher horsepower competition, and that would be things like the Volvo XC60 with its 3-liter twin-scroll turbo inline-6, or the BMW X3 with its twin-scroll turbo 3-liter inline-6, those are going to be faster than the RDX, but they're also going to be considerably more expensive. Bang for the buck really is what the RDX gets for you, because this may be a little bit more expensive than the Lexus NX200T or the starting price on the Lincoln MKC, but we get much more power and much better acceleration. The light curb weight also helps us out when it comes to braking. Fade resistance is not quite as good as some of the entries in this segment, most notably the Lincoln MKC or the BMW X3, but initial stopping distances are very good, and I don't expect that most people will ever notice really much of a fade resistance problem with the RDX. There's been a lot of speculation about the tow rating in the RDX, but honestly, the most logical reason for that low tow rating is the fact that compact crossover shoppers just don't tow with their compact crossover. When it comes to handling, the RDX does relatively well, but there are a number of entries in this segment that do handle and feel a little bit better. Now, the Lincoln MKC is an interesting vehicle because it has a very, very soft suspension, and although it handles relatively well, it doesn't feel all that great out on the road. It does feel a little bit wallowy, and that's not going on in the RDX, even though we do have those taller profile tires. The big difference here is that we definitely have a front-wheel drive bias in this vehicle. So when you're going around the corners, it definitely feels a little front heavy, and the rear end is not getting any extra power to help it feel more like a rear-wheel drive vehicle. And that is a sharp departure from the first generation RDX, which had super handling all-wheel drive, and when you started to push it in the corners, it felt more like a rear-wheel drive vehicle. The other difference you'll notice in this all-wheel drive system is that we still get torque steer like you do in the front-wheel drive version of the RDX. It's a lot more muted than in the front-wheel drive version, but it is still there from a stop. That's quite different than you'll find in the Lincoln MKC or the Volvo XC60, which do have a clutch pack in the center of the vehicle that can completely lock up and send 50% of the power to the rear whenever it wants to. One thing that affects both the cabin noise and the fuel economy in the RDX is that all models get a cylinder deactivation system. So under the right conditions, this vehicle will operate just on 3 cylinders instead of all 6. Now 3-cylinder engines are obviously not as smooth as 4 or 6-cylinder engines, and a 3-cylinder engine does not have the same kind of balance characteristics as a 6-cylinder engine. So it is noticeable when this vehicle changes to its 3-cylinder mode. You can feel a slight vibration in the car, and the exhaust note definitely changes out on the highway. Personally, I didn't really find that distracting, and I'd rather the vehicle did that and save me the fuel economy rather than leaving all 6 cylinders in action, but I do know that some shoppers out there have complained about it. By switching to that 3-cylinder mode, I have been averaging a relatively impressive 23.8 miles per gallon over about 700 miles of mixed driving in this vehicle. That's a little bit better than BMW's X3 or their X4 with the 2-liter turbocharged engine. And that's really saying something because that 2-liter turbo is very efficient and also has an 8-speed automatic. We only have a 6-speed under this hood. Now, the fuel economy is not quite as good as the XC60 T5 Drive-E, which is front-wheel drive, but it is still fairly good. The biggest difference that you'll notice in the fuel economy scores on those two vehicles is that the Volvo gets a much better city score than this vehicle. That's due largely to the 6-cylinder engine, because when we are cylinder deactivating in this vehicle, we get relatively comparable highway mileage to that Volvo with the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. All models of the RDX get Acura's active noise cancellation system. However, it is still a little bit louder in this cabin than some of the models out there. At 50 miles an hour, I scored 70 decibels, which is a little bit louder than the X3, the Volvo XC60, or the Lincoln MKC. The RDX really excels when it comes to the ride because even though we get a very good handling score, we also get an excellent ride score. That's due as much to these 60 series tires as a very well-tuned suspension system. The RDX uses Acura's 2-mode damper system, which helps filter out large imperfections out on the road while still allowing you to feel smaller imperfections. They do this by giving traditional struts 2 different valves. So this is not an electronic adaptive suspension system like you'll find in the Lincoln MKC or in certain other European models. This is actually a traditional damper setup with 2 valves, a large one and a small one. Those 2 valves allow the dampers in this vehicle to react differently to differing inputs. It allows us to have that crisp feel in corners, but also be able to soak up things like large potholes, speed bumps, etc., like a softer suspension would. The combination of Acura's tire selection and the suspension design and the 2-mode damping system means that this really does ride in the 90th percentile. This has an excellent highway ride for long highway trips, but we also still get that excellent handling ability when we start entering the corners. Right up until you push it to right about 9/10 or so, and that's when it's really obvious that this is still a front-wheel drive biased, front-heavy vehicle. Overall, out on the road, the RDX is very pleasing to drive. Now, I still wish this had the super handling all-wheel drive system because my only major complaints are the torque steer, the fact that it does feel a little bit front-heavy in the corners, even under power, and that is something that super handling all-wheel drive would solve for me. Even with the new Lexus NX and the Lincoln MKC, the RDX is one of the best values in this segment. Now, you shouldn't confuse low starting price with best value because they're not necessarily the same thing. Pricing for 2015 starts at $35,270, and if you option your RDX all the way up, you'll hit $43,420. The RDX comes in nearly identical configurations in front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. All-wheel drive adds $1,500. And new for this year, Acura is allowing us to get the Acura Watch package for $1,300, even essentially on that base model. The push for Acura Watch is something that we recently saw on the 2016 Acura ILX. It is what Acura is calling their new active safety package. It's collision mitigating braking, lane keeping assist, lane departure warning, and the radar adaptive cruise control. Notably, not part of Acura Watch specifically is the blind spot monitoring system or rear cross traffic detection. Those are available as part of other packages. The big thing to know here is that because of the way Acura bundles options and the way dealers typically stock their lots, you should find a large percentage of RDXs on dealer lots with those active safety systems. The Lincoln MKC starts just over $33,000 and the Lexus NX starts around $34,500 or so. Both of those are less expensive than a base RDX. However, both of them have less feature content and much less power under the hood. This has only that one engine available, so it is a little bit different than the competition, which usually has at least 2 engines available. The base V6 engine is important to consider, especially when you couple that with the light curb weight we get in the RDX. It means that we have a very good power to weight ratio in all RDX models, but especially when you compare this with the base competition, which starts between about 220 horsepower and 250 horsepower. Value is obviously the strong suit for this Acura model. When you compare it to a comparably equipped Lincoln MKC, this will actually be about $3,000 less, versus a comparably equipped Lexus NX, it's about $4,800 less. Compared to the Germans, this is almost $10,000 less than a comparably equipped Audi Q5 and a whopping $13,000 less than a comparably equipped X3. Comparisons are a little bit interesting, especially because we no longer get the super handling all-wheel drive system that the RDX was known for in its first version and that Acura has been known for in general for some time. Super handling all-wheel drive allows certain Acura models to feel more like rear-wheel drive models than front-wheel drive models, and that is not happening in the RDX like it's happening in the Acura MDX. So the Acura MDX feels quite nimble for a front-wheel drive 3-row crossover vehicle. It actually feels much more like a BMW X5 than you might think out on the road, because it can send nearly 90% of the power to the rear anytime it wants to. When we take a look at this Acura RDX, however, it's a little bit different because this is both front-heavy and strongly front-biased. This can only send 40% of the power to the rear, and you definitely notice that out on the road. So we still get a little bit of torque steer. We definitely don't get that rear-wheel drive feeling that you can get in the TLX or the MDX. That means in terms of handling dynamics, this will feel more like a Cadillac SRX, a Lincoln MKX, a Lexus RX, the Lexus NX, the Volvo XC60, the Lincoln MKC, etc. Again, as I said, there are a large number of front-wheel drive or front-wheel drive based crossovers in this segment. As such, I can't necessarily say that's a negative on the RDX because a lot of those vehicles are also sold in their front-wheel drive trims. Although the Audi Q5 is sold only as an all-wheel drive model in the United States, it is a front-heavy vehicle, so it may have a slight rear bias, but it is still front-heavy. Therefore, the handling purists in this segment would be the BMW X3 as well as the Mercedes-Benz GLK. Really only two models in this very large segment. That circles us right back around to value, because the RDX may not be the best handling vehicle in the segment, it may not be the fastest vehicle in the segment, and it may not have the nicest interior in the segment, but it does score top-notch in most categories, and it is extremely well priced. If you're after a better value than the BMW X3 or the Mercedes-Benz GLK, or even the Volvo XC60, you should also head on over to the Acura dealer. This isn't quite the same level of handling ability or driving ability as an X3, but it's not necessarily that far off, and it costs about $10,000 less when comparably equipped. The other thing, of course, to consider in this particular segment is that the RDX is likely going to be more reliable, cost less to maintain, and less to insure than many of the other entries in this segment. So not only is your starting price going to be less expensive, you're also going to spend less in the long term. With all that put together, I think the RDX has two simple paths to being my favorite entry in this compact luxury crossover segment. I think that if Acura made a 2-liter hybrid version with the Honda Accord's hybrid system, I think I would place this tops on my list because it would get incredible fuel economy. Or if they made super handling all-wheel drive an option for, say, about $2,500, I'd be willing to pay for it because I think that really would make the RDX a very tasty option in this segment. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2016 Acura RDX. Go ahead and click that subscribe button at the bottom of your screen. Click on over to those related videos. Find me over on Facebook, find me on Twitter, and you can always email your questions to alex@alexnautos.com. I'll see you next week.